Okay, I know we are getting to talk about chapters 15 through 19, and I am more than excited to hear what these did for you or didn't do for you, or things you'd like to talk about further. So let me open the floor and see if there were comments or questions or like disappointments that you brought from these 5 chapters.
I guess I'll start.
Please.
I was just rereading a little bit this morning to refresh my memory and about the chapter on go fish.
Mhm.
And I'd marked the part at the end where it says be a fish, nothing more. And I thought, why would you say be a fish? What does that mean? And I had to go back, reread more of the chapter and how being part of a community, I think, is what I took so much from it, and how School of Fish and how what they all do to keep the school alive and going and supporting each other. And, I really like that, really resonated as far as what each member can do, as a small part, and just being a small part of that.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And somebody shared an article with me this week. I'm trying to remember who wrote it, but it was like in the Christian Century, and it talked about how we have this tendency, especially like when we hear these stories as a kid, to like put ourselves in places in the narrative that are like the nice places in the story. So like this particular article was like talking about the Exodus story. And this is true. Like I grew up thinking like, oh, like I'm one of the Israelites, like I'm one of these like good people. And the article is like, no, you're probably one of the Egyptians. Like you're probably like benefiting from somebody else's toil, and you might reconsider that. And it just sort of made me think further about this fishing business, about how I also heard as a kid, like, hey, fishermen, like you're out there like casting a line and hooking them for the Lord. But like, that's weird. Like, how did you transition from becoming a fish to a person? Like maybe that's not the right read. Like, maybe we put ourselves in this position of like, oh, okay, like I'm better than all the other people, instead of like, oh, I'm like everybody else. And the question is like, how do we do this thing together? Darlene, please.
One thing I liked about this chapter, the Go Fish chapter, is in that last paragraph on page 49, where it says be a fish, draw undesirable people with the undesirable parts of ourselves from the deep chaos into his presence. I really like that concept of not only pulling undesirable people into our pool, our what do you call that when the fish swim together?
School.
Thank you. As well as the undesirable parts of ourselves. To me, that just reemphasizes that God loves even those undesirable parts of ourselves. I mean, he loves us not just in spite of it, but because that's who we are. That's our humanness. Because being human doesn't mean being human means we are both desirable and undesirable. Yeah. So I really like that concept. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Well, I was really grateful to read that part of the bishop's blog. I guess I'd grown up thinking these are like real fishers, like they're out there with hooks and lines instead of these are net fishers, and that they're dragnet fishers. I mean, they're bringing the junk, which is just, it's sort of cool to think about how like it's a very different way to think about like God dredging the bottom of the lake and being happy to have the junk. Yeah. And I don't know, I think it's an interesting concept because we as Episcopalians tend to be very interested in order and propriety. And I do love those things, to be honest. And it's interesting when you go somewhere like Lord of the Streets, where an outburst in the middle of the sermon is very normal. Yeah. This is what people do. And it's sort of well, how do you make room? This is the real question to me is how do we make room in a community, to like dragnet each other and then like say like, oh, look, a used damaged toilet seat. Like, glad we found that, like.
What can we do with that? How
What
are
can we
we
do?
going to recycle that?
Or even, I mean, even we don't even have to do anything. Just like, hey, neat
Just
that's in your
appreciate.
lake, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I always want to do something with it. I always want to like,
Me
like
too.
renovate it and put it on a functioning toilet. But like maybe
Put a
not
potted
everything.
plant in it. Put a
Yeah,
plant-
maybe not everything has to do anything. Maybe it's just like, okay, like you got that thing, and like you do.
Mhm.
I got a lot of used toilet seats in my life, if I'm honest. If you don't mind me saying, like, I still like when I was reading this again, I was like, that was like not a bad chapter. Like that was an interesting chapter, but like there's still like the cognitive like level where I'm like, yeah, that's probably what it's about. And then like, oh, like God, like how do I do that? Because I still am really, I mean, just to be clear, like I'm really interested in like making things useful, or like recalibrating them so they do something instead of just like, oh, okay, like that's a part of you and it's fine. Like God's actually really interested in drawing that into the community and into God. That God cares about that for its own sake, not to do something with it. That's like the hard turn for me. Maybe if I say it enough, I'll start to do it. I don't know. Probably not. I probably need like some mentoring in how to do it.
I think it's interesting that part of me too wants to apply that, drawing people in and helping them be a part of what's going on. I found myself doing that when I would work with the homeless, and we would have meal time and devotional time, and so I tend to draw people in who would like to do the prayer, who would like to read the scripture. And so that's such a part of my value system. But there were some people that just didn't want to do that. And they needed to be on the periphery. They needed to be able to pace back and forth. They needed to be able to go out and smoke during the prayer if they needed to. And I had to learn that that's okay. That's what their comfort level is. And not everybody wants to be a functioning part of the group. So I learned to respect that need and that difference in them. So I learned a lot from them as well as them. I think I learned more from them than they did from me.
I think that's usually ought to be the way it goes, from my own experience. It does put an interesting tension in my head there that didn't show up in this chapter that I don't really know how to do. Like I feel like if you've been involved in the food distributions we do, what I think is really cool is like they're extremely evangelistic in the sense that like there's newcomers every time. And there's newcomers that like don't go to church here and probably don't want to, but they come and they do that thing, and so it's sort of like, okay, like we're doing this thing and you can be a part of it and it's a good thing, whoever or wherever you are. I feel really great about that. I mean, I do. I feel great about that. Or like, hey, you're into church and your spouse is into shrimp boils. So how about if your spouse throws us a shrimp boil, like that would be lovely, right? Like I get that. I am having a hard time though with like, okay, so you include people in ministry who may or may not be interested in church. And I think that's right. But I'm not always clear, like, so then what about people who don't have any kind of church basis? And like, I don't know, it's funny, like I'm gonna say this maybe in the wrong way, but don't take it the wrong way. Like, it's almost like when people haven't had church experience, it's almost like we have to like trick them or convince them that the way we do it is the right way. So, hey, you never done this, and let me just show you how we do it right over here. Like it makes the evangelism thing like stickier. I think I grew up with this like clear conception, like what you do is you invite a friend to church because the way we do it is really good, and you teach them how to value the way we do it. And I know that's not wrong. But I'm not sure it's totally right either, and so like there's just a little bit of like stickiness in that for me. And like, and I realize, I don't know that I'm very good at that. Like, I think, I feel like I have some strength for people who grew up, frankly, with like a not super good spirituality, like showing them that like maybe there is some goodness in this, right? Like you can recast this language and you can like redo this. That might be like what I do, but I don't know that I do the other thing very well, you know, like, and I have to admit, when I meet people in the community who I'm going to see regularly, like kind of like not sure I want them to come to church, because then we might not be able to be friends anymore. You know, like it's a little bit weird as a clergy person, but I think even as a parishioner, it's a little bit weird, right? Because like you invite somebody to your church and they come and like, oh, I don't know, what are they going to think, you know, and like, is that going to affect our relationship? Because like they didn't like what I like. And I don't know, I just want to throw that out there and see if anybody else has thought about those things.
Well, I haven't thought about it before, but as you were talking, and I would think, well, what if, so when is it possible, or is it okay to think about this is how we do it, and we find it really resonates with us and it brings us closer to God and to Christ, but except there's other ways to also be closer to God and to Christ, and that, you know, what's good and what's bad, maybe there is some boundaries, but that there's so many expressions of that. And here is a way that we hope that, you know, that you can also be closer to God. And wouldn't it be great we are friends and we can do it together? Wouldn't that be great? Or, but here's just something else to try. I mean, is that?
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense. I mean, I'm really fast to recommend a restaurant I enjoyed to somebody, knowing that they may not like it, like, you know, like they may not, but I'm happy to say, like, I really enjoyed that restaurant, but this feels different to me for some reason, like it's maybe more personal, or like, I don't know, like, you know, like if even when I recommend restaurants, I usually have in mind what I know of the other person and what they may or may not enjoy. And this one's a little bit harder because they're not always clear, like what people will or won't enjoy. And I think you said this really like thing that I think is part, I hear is the core of the Episcopal Church that can also be very, how do I say, like, can create a lot of inertia, which is like, hey, there's plenty of fine ways to do it. This just happens to be the way I find value in it. Like I'm a real believer in that concept, but it can also result in like, well, so then your way is probably great, you know, like, and that can be true, and you might benefit from the way we do it over here too. You know, like it, you know what I mean? It starts to become like kind of complicated. I don't know if y'all know this, but like Judaism is not evangelical, like not. Like there's nobody handing out tracts on why you should convert to Judaism. In fact, if you're like, hey, Rabbi, I'd like to become Jewish, usually the rabbi's like, why? like why do you want to do that? And I kind of like, there's that position, and then there's like this like rally Sunday or like pack the pews Sunday approach, or like, you know, you get some kind of jewels in your heavenly crown for bringing people to church. And I see the Episcopal Church sort of more over here, like not all the way over here, but sort of more over here. And it's weird when you read these books like written by Episcopalians about evangelism, because oddly enough, like they sound more like this. They sound more like, you should like bring the great news. But like, I don't know, I find like there's some tension in that a little bit, you know, like if you take seriously that God wants to drag you wherever you are, like that's good news. Like wherever you are, God wants to drag you, even against your will. Like God would like to drag you somewhere better. I find that very hopeful, actually, very, very hopeful. But you get to be you get to be yourself, which may not be like me or Julia or Carolyn, or, you know, like it may not be like us. And that's where I think invitation becomes a little complicated.
I'm wondering if the hesitancy toward evangelism for us, it could come from a couple of different things. One, I see us as tending to be more open to divergent views and divergent people, and more open to considering, as Adele said, there are many ways to worship God.
Yeah.
And that philosophy, that attitude, also kind of maybe connected with, I see us as being more reserved, not as demonstrative or outgoing as some denominations. So I think maybe those two qualities, and there may be other things that contribute to our hesitancy to evangelize, but I'm just wondering if those two might play a part.
Well, I appreciate that, Darlene, and I think this is going to sound nuts, but I had to take this class in seminary. We had 4 core areas we had to take classes from, like Bible study and history and theology and like Christian practices. So I had to take this class that was about evangelism. And it was like the techniques of evangelism. And I remember, this is like evangelism 101, right? And I remember asking the teacher, like, hey, so I hear we're talking about all the forms, but like, what about the content? Like, what is the good news? And the teacher was like, oh, we're not gonna talk about that in this class. And I was like, whoa. It seems like the most important thing. Like, what is the good news, you know? And I think that's part of it, right? Is like, it's really, and because of my own history, I have to be honest, I'm probably more sensitive to that. Like, I was just talking to somebody who was asking me what I believed. Like, do you believe in this or that? And I was like, oh my God, I'm so not interested in talking about what I believe. Like, I'm so uninterested in that because I know what you're going to do with that. Or, you know what, honestly, maybe they're not going to do that. Maybe I'm doing that to myself. Like, I'm pegging myself into categories. Like, do you believe in a real heaven? And I was like, oh, like, if I say like, hey, I'm pretty sure the scriptures are inviting us into like a fuller way of living now, that's like equivocating and not answering their box checking question. And it makes me feel bad. I did say that. I said, you know, like, hey, all that's fine, but I'm pretty sure the scriptures are about how we live now. And if all that were really, really important, that we know what happens after we die, there'd be a book called What Happens After You Die. But that book did not make it into the Bible. We can pretend it did. I mean, that's the problem, is like, we pretend all the time that you get a halo and a harp and a thing, but none of that's in the book. There's seminars I've seen, like, they go around and tell you about what heaven's going to be like after you die. And like, how do you know that? Because we didn't get that in the book. Like, I think you're making that up. I understand it's important to people, but I think like the fact that it's not important to the Bible reminds us it's probably not as important as we think it is. But that becomes really difficult because like, there's really, I don't know how you have that conversation. And maybe it only happens when people ask, or maybe it happens when we say like, well, look, are you asking what I believe so you can size me up, or because you'd like to really know what's important to me? I'm afraid to ask a question like that because it feels very like discourteous.
It feels invasive to me. Yeah.
But asking a question, what do you believe? You know, that's could be considered invasive. So perhaps this, you know, so yes, it could be either way. So I think it would be okay to say, oh, I'm happy to share that, but what would you, you know, is this why you want to use it, or is that? And I don't think I would have the forethought to ask that before jumping in with my answer, but I think that would be perfectly valid to ask that first.
Yeah. Before
sharing something so personal.
Yeah, tell me why you want to know so I know which story to tell you.
Yeah.
When I was a girl and dating, my mother would always, the boy would have to come inside to get me. And my mother would always, we had a bar, and she would always offer cookies and coffee or whatever. And the Bible was always on the bar. And she would initiate conversation about the scripture. Now, she would ask the boy or the young man, what do you believe about this? And that was so uncomfortable for me because I felt like, what is she doing? Is she grilling him to see if it's okay for me to go out with him? Or because I would always date boys outside my church. I didn't interdate. And so they would, I had all kinds of denominations in my dating calendar. And I felt like, what is she doing? Would she just hush, close that Bible and just let me go on my date? So I have some real aversion to putting people on the spot with difficult conversations.
Yeah, I found, and like, I think this bears out truthfully, you know, like if you look at the Diet of Worms where Martin Luther goes on trial, it happened in such a way that it forced him into a position I'm not sure he really wanted to have. And pretty much most biographers and historians tend to agree with this, that it pushed him to an either or when he really wanted to have a both and. And I know that I've got some significant relationships. In fact, I went to seminary with somebody who, so this is somebody with an MDiv like I have, actually carried the flag at the graduation, who I don't think knows exactly where they are, but if you ask pointed questions, they're nowhere. Like it forces them to say, I don't believe that sentence. Instead of like, well, I'm still trying to find my way, you know, or like these commitments matter to me. And I wonder if sometimes evangelism becomes this way of like, oh, well, you're too small, I'll throw you back. Or I don't want your kind in my catch. I got to tell you, sometimes I don't, there's sometimes people I would like to throw back because they're a lot of work. I don't want to regale you with stories, but you know, like that's a thing. And like a core commitment is like, okay, but that's why you're here. Like, you know, like I meet these people in clergy networks that are like, well, I just really need to find a church that's like financially stable and like where people are nice to each other. And it's like, well, then why do they need you? Like, what are you going to do? You're just going to run that thing that can run itself already? Like, you know, like the work is that like we get somewhere, right? Hopefully somewhere.
Maybe this goes back, because I had a question I wanted to follow up with on the chapter, Go Fish, as we were talking about how Christ has this, or God has this very big net that's dredging and it's pulling up the good and the bad and all this. We bring everything to our relationship with God, and he loves us as a whole person and all.
Yeah.
And so so there's, you know, and the examples we give are things that are, I guess, innocuous, you know, the old used toilet or whatever. But what about parts of us, all of us, you know, that can be harmful to ourselves or to other people? And how do we think about that as far as bringing it all together to the community and God's view of us and just that whole thing? How do we think about it?
So I think the easy way to start, Adele, is, and my last mentoring rector talked about this, there's a parachurch group called Stephen Ministry, and it's where you train people to be like to do pastoral visitation, you know, and like they go and they visit folk, and it does some good work, right? And there's regular continuing education, and that's a small self-selecting group who wants to do this. But my previous mentor was like, look, that costs a lot of money, and in some ways it can be really exclusive, and like what I would like to have is like a Rolodex of like people, because like, let's pretend you've just had a child who has like what we would call a birth defect. That's not a super fair word to use, but like a congenital birth defect, and the child dies within a year. Do you want somebody to come and meet you who's never had that experience, or somebody who's lived through it? So like, I think it's interesting to think like, okay, what if there was a pastoral care Rolodex where I can say, look, I see this is happening, and I know a person in the congregation who's done that. It's still a wound, but it's scarred over for them. Can I connect you? You don't connect two people that are having arterial bleeding spiritually. That's not going to be healthy, right? But is there a way we can do that? So I don't know that it's like an open Rolodex, like, hey, if you got a pornography addiction, you can talk to the Reverend who had one too. But I think there might be a way where we could figure this out, like, okay, trust is earned in small bits, right? And hopefully we can be our integrated selves wherever we go. And some things like are intimate, but there's times when intimacy is appropriate. So I wonder if that's sort of one way, which is this like pastoral care Rolodex. I mean, I would tell you, like, Adele, if I meet you the first time and I'm like, hey, I was abused as a child by my dad, like physically, verbally, and sexually, and I've got an eating disorder, you would probably think like, wow, that's a weird introduction. Like, I was just asking for your name, right? Because trust is built in small increments. And when we share, when we overshare, it's actually not connecting. It's a way of like putting like our bright lights on somebody and it's blinding, right? And yet there's times in my life where people have been intimate relatively quickly that have been very beneficial. So I don't want to discount that. But part of it is like, what container is there for that, right? If the container is in a sermon, I say, hey, during today's piece, everybody's going to share what you struggle with intimately. I don't think that's a good container. On the other hand, I do like to think that we as church folks can do a little more than we do. And maybe the reminder is like, hey, we trust we're mature enough to do this together. And if you're not, don't do it. You know, like when our day school kids hear the call to prayer in Arabic, usually they laugh because it like sounds funny to them. Like they don't know what the words mean and it's a different intonation. And I usually remind them, this is going to sound different. And I trust you're mature enough to handle this. And if you're not, we won't do this again until we grow up another year. And I don't think that's stern disciplinarian. It's about respect, right? And sometimes people can't handle it. And this is what we do in public life, is we try to figure out what we can do when.
It's definitely true. Not everybody is able to handle other people's issues. You know, either they're not well equipped their own way, you know, emotionally, or they don't have the skills and they'll learn it, you know, and have not the experience and such. So we're all such a mix of abilities and what we can handle, you know, and personality, how open we are and how closed we are. But it is, you know, I think we have to continue to remind ourselves, we have to embrace, just like is repeated many times in here and what we hear, you know, in the sermons and such, is how we have to embrace the whole person, you know, and calling people in and accepting them. But I know, but then it does get more difficult when it is something like maybe it's aggressiveness or other personality aspects that are harder to get along with people. But how, you know, we're really challenged, I think, to try to include people with those traits anyway. And it's not easy. It's not pleasant. You know? So I don't know how to do that, but I think we're called to do that.
Yeah, I think we have to sometimes remember, like, what is this for? And then sometimes it'll happen once and we'll think, oh, this is going to happen forever, so it shouldn't continue, when really maybe it was only going to happen that one time. So like one time I was preaching and a guy with like bipolar schizophrenia got up and started talking in the sermon and everybody was looking for the exits, you know, and he just said some stuff that didn't make sense and then he left. Like he just walked down to the church, but was like, thanks, you know, and left. And I was like, oh my God, I could not do that every week. I could not. And I was thinking like, is this going to be like how I'm going to spend the next like several years, this happening? But in the moment I knew like, hey, maybe this is the first time anybody let the guy talk. Mm-hmm. And so maybe that day was really just for him. And if I didn't project all the like, oh, this is the rest of my ministry being interrupted and whatever, I could really have enjoyed it even more than I did. I'll tell you, I'm not sure that I enjoyed it in the moment, but I knew to be quiet. This happened like 6 years ago here. So I think there is like, so like the why are we here is important. There's like this horror story that you hear. Every church has horror stories, like where people who have autism or people who have like neurodiversity or whatever will come and they'll like pace in the back because sitting still drives them nuts. And there's a story I heard recently where the preacher was like, hey, that distracts me, so don't come anymore, or like do that in the narthex. And it's sort of like, oh my God, like how could you say that? Because like that person being in the building is more important than anything you have to say. And maybe you just say that, like, I just lost my place and I'm so glad I'm so glad we know that me losing my place is less important than us including people. And maybe that's the sermon. And I didn't think it's bad to highlight that that's happening in real time. You know, it's sort of like there's this risk you take, like if I share a personal story, and by the way, I like to mostly share my stories because they're mine. I don't like to share other people's stories because they're not mine. I do sometimes. Some people have better stories than I do, but I try to share my own stories. And some people say, well, you're just talking about yourself. Or they'll say, like, you've said you have a hard time forgiving people, so I'm not going to talk to you. And it's sort of like, well, that's a risk I take. You know, it's a risk I take. And I'll talk about bits of my story without telling the whole story. And those are some ways I think we can do that, right? Because this isn't a therapy group. And yet, like, it's important to me that I model, I'm like the villain of my own story sometimes, and that I struggle with stuff too. And if I don't say, like, hey, I just had this major like grief experience and here's what was helpful for me, then where's it coming from, what I'm going to say? Like, part of, I think, my call is to talk about how we can take better care of each other, right? And if I don't say where that information is coming from, then I don't know. So I think it's always like a risk. And sometimes maybe I do overshare. I don't know the answer to that. Sometimes maybe I do. But I've decided, like, it's more important to be vulnerable than to be invulnerable.
I think it shows our common humanity, you know, for, you know, you as one of all of us as well. And I think that, to me, that's how I receive it.
I hope so, right? And I also hope it's helpful to hear, like, hey, like, I'm wearing this fancy necklace, but doesn't mean I'm better than anybody. Doesn't mean you should have my spirituality either. We're on the road together, and we've all got what we've got. And we're going somewhere. See, that's the thing. It's not just that we're like in the middle of nowhere. Like, we actually are going somewhere together. And maybe that's the piece that gets lost. Like, I'm okay, you're okay. That's true. And we're going somewhere, hopefully, together. I know we talked about unclean spirits a lot, like 3 weeks ago. And I didn't know if that chapter on unclean spirits was helpful or not. But I do want to raise up that I see, like, this interesting thing happening socially that might bear, you can decide what you think of it, which is like, hey, because you don't fit into like traditional patterns of like social roles, it doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. You know, like, I was talking to my wife about how like gender nonconformity is still new for me, right? So I'll just be clear, like, I'm way fine with the whole LGBTQ. That's totally fine. Like, I'm converted, but I found myself saying, like, boy, if my daughter was like, hey, I you know, I'm in the wrong body type, I'd probably struggle with that, because I probably would struggle with that. I like to think I'd come out on the right end of like, hey, I'm your dad no matter what, and I support you being yourself. But it's just like such a new idea for me. It's always easier when it's other people. I just want to be clear. When it's your kids, it's like, oh, but honey, I don't know if I want that for you, you know? And so, like, one of the ways I guess I've chosen to read unclean spirits in Luke is that, like, actually there's nothing wrong with the person. There's the perception that there's something wrong with the person. And that sometimes what Jesus does is says, like, hey, you think there's something wrong with this person, so let me take care of what you think is wrong with the person, so now you can be with this person.
So say that again. So
Sometimes the unclean spirit is not in another person, it's in our hearts.
And where that was your last line of that chapter, instead of them changing, could we, which I, really highlighted that. But at the same time, in the miracles, isn't Jesus helping correct those deformities to help that person be a part of the community?
Sometimes, but he does it in these funny ways, right? He says, what's easier to do? Forgive somebody's sins or make them walk again, which in people's mind were like maybe the same thing anyway.
Yeah.
I think maybe our interpretation, their interpretation, and our interpretation of the miracles and his ridding them of the unclean spirits is that the spirit was in the person that was different. This ties in with your statement in that next to last paragraph. What if the unclean spirit he drove out that day was the fear, blame, and prejudice of everyone else against the man? When we fear something, we tend to demonize it. We tend to say it's bad because we're afraid of it. And so our fear of the difference could be the unclean spirit rather than the difference in the person that's being healed.
Yeah, I think, thank you, Darlene. And I think a way maybe I've said it before because somebody told me I said it. I don't necessarily remember it. It's like, maybe the only thing that's wrong with us is that we think there's something wrong with us. I mean, at the core level, I make plenty of wrong decisions. That isn't what's wrong with me. I don't know if that makes sense. I mean, I have to say, like, particularly as a parent, if I were less prone to being afraid, not only would like parenting be a lot more enjoyable, but I just think I'd be a much better parent, but when I see my child like burp and not say, excuse me, I'm like, oh my God, she's going to grow up with no manners. I hope I'm not the only parent that thinks that. And what it does is it's like, there's something wrong with you, child. I have modeled to say, excuse me, or like other people will not perceive you as polite, and that is wrong. Instead of like, just a simple reminder, like, hey, in our family, we say, excuse me, like you can still say that without being afraid.
Well, and the fear, it's also, what is the reflection on me that I didn't teach them to have better manners? I think that's definitely part of the underlying fear.
I agree.
In that example, as how it affected my family and how I raised my kids or tried. And,
it's funny you say that because that happens a few times in the scriptures where people say to Jesus, like, look, your disciples are not keeping the Torah, which I think is less a description of them than an accusation of him as a rabbi. If you were a good teacher, your people would do everything right. I mean, having taught math class, like I wanted my kids to get them all right. And there's a certain level where like, that's what we want. That's good, right? But it's not necessarily a reflection on my value or worth if my kids make arithmetic mistakes and problem solving. Julia, are you coming on? Yeah.
Well, I think I heard a quote recently and I'm trying to figure out where it was. I feel like it was Willie Nelson, but I could be wrong. And it just, I have to find it before I tell it because I don't remember, but it sort of reminded me of like what it's about letting you be like accepting a person for as they are. I'll try to find it and then let you know if I do.
Thank you. I think the reason all this acceptance matters that we so often forget, though, like I've heard people say, like, well, what are we including people in? Like inclusivity means we're including them in something, not just including everything. But I think like what we often forget is like, this is about including those parts of ourselves that we're afraid of. and that we don't do super well, right? Like I recently read this book, I think it was The Body Keeps Score, about how we've done this weird thing where we've talked about like our mind is separate from our body, and like I'm going to beat my body in submission mentally by making myself keep these New Year's resolutions or like go to the gym or whatever, instead of like, no, your body lives in your mind, or your mind lives in your body, right? Like you're an integrated person. And sure enough, like your different parts have conversations all the time. and you know, sometimes the majority rules, but hopefully we can come to consensus about what we do. I know that the catching the cooties chapter in 18 was a lot kind of like chapter 15, but it does make me wonder about the stigmatization that continues to happen. Like, oh, I didn't know you voted for blank. And all of a sudden I can put some cooties on somebody in a jiffy because of like who they voted for, or like how they feel about masking, or like, why didn't you get a vaccine, or like whatever it is. Those are like a low hanging fruit right now, you know, like those three. Or like how you feel about you know, statuaries that honor the Confederacy. Like these become like really quick polarizing points that I kind of think are the cooties game. And look, like I think all of that stuff matters, but like surely how we talk about it is just as important, if not more so. That's what I wonder, like, forgive me for saying this, because I think it happens on both sides. I wonder if like evangelism hasn't become like political instead of communal. Let me tell you the good news. You wear that mask. Let me tell you the good news. You don't get a vaccine. Let me tell you the good news. Let's go, Brandon. I mean, whatever it is that you say, right? I'm afraid that's become evangelism. And sometimes we map it onto like church and spirituality instead of like, oh my God, look, we disagree again. And how can I be in relationship with you and appreciate you?
Or, and then the converse, what I'm experiencing is that it causes a distance. So someone like me avoiding conflict and all, especially, so my brother has a different political and outlook, you know, views. So in the last few years, I find that, you know, we still get together and talk, but it's harder. I find myself avoiding some conversations or openness and vulnerability because I want to avoid any conflict and ill at ease and, you know, feelings, or and that's how I find, at least in that particular relationship, how it's affecting us.
But I think, Adele, sometimes that is honoring in a relationship. I mean, just to be honest, right? Like I have a brother who's committed to practicing Orthodox Judaism. Mm-hmm. And what I've come to learn, and I don't know why this is the case, because I'm actually very curious about that. He doesn't want to talk about that with me. Mm-hmm. And maybe it's because he feels like I'm going to appropriate what he says, or maybe he feels like because I'm a priest, like I'm going to be judged. I don't know why, but it doesn't ever go well, like ever. Mm-hmm. So I just quit asking.
Yeah.
And I think that's what he wants. It doesn't mean I never try. Actually, it's really sensitive to say, I think, okay, like this is not something you want to talk about.
But then do you find you're still able to be on the same level of closeness with him in other conversations and other aspects of your life? You know, family?
If I'll allow it, yeah. I actually will tell you, like, I was really terrified about what he was going to say, because he was one of the 3 people who gave eulogies at my dad's funeral. And he had texted me like, how is your daughter like our dad? And I was like, oh God, like, I don't know if I can do this. Mm-hmm. I wrote back, she has blue eyes. And he wrote to me, I knew you would take the easy road. And I was like, I almost texted back something colorful. Uh, Instead, I said, like, if you talk, like, do not talk about me in your eulogy, because that's what I needed. And I was terrified he was going to say, like, my brother learned this from our dad. And I would have been so furious if he'd done that. And I was planning, what will I do if he does? Which just tells you a little bit more about me. And he didn't talk about how my daughter was like him. And maybe because I wouldn't participate, I don't know, and maybe I'm hard-hearted or whatever, but he didn't. And strangely, I didn't think like, oh, he did that to honor me. I was like, well, it just wasn't good material for him. You know, like, I didn't take it as a gift. And so, like, I think there's this other opportunity to say, like, oh, maybe he did listen to you. And like, you didn't want that done and he didn't do it. And so, like, I think there's these moments, Adele, where, like, I can be like, well, it's just because he couldn't think of something clever. Or I could say, well, actually, he chose not to bring that up. And those are like these like turning points. And actually, I don't even know what's true, but I know what will make my life better. Like, I know which belief will make my life better. And actually, some of the things he said about our dad, I was like relieved to hear. Like they were affirmative and complicated, and like, because people are complicated, you know, people are complicated. Even though, like, I don't think we can talk much about religion, I don't think we can, even though I'd like to. We don't. And then there's just other areas, and in some ways, like, our closeness gets relegated to certain things. It doesn't mean certain things are off limits. It's just for some reason we trigger one another. And so for now, we just avoid the triggers if we can. And maybe later, like, we can return. But if we, you know, if it has to be, we have to be able to talk about this and we can't, that's an all or nothing deal that I'm not sure sets us up to succeed. The success is not that, like, we agree, it's that we're able to listen to each other.
Thank you.
And I wish we were closer than we are. Well, for lots of reasons, like including the way we were raised and some of the core memories that we have, which are different. His core memories of the way we were raised are different from mine. It makes that harder. You know, it makes it harder. I see siblings who seem to be best friends, and I'm like, why did I get that? And hey, I'm part of the problem. You know, like, and by the way, it's not like siblings have to be best friends. I always think it's cool when you see it. It's just not in my family.
For me, the trick is to listen without judgment. That is the hard part. Just listening to what is without trying to make it right or wrong.
Yeah.
Or less than me or better than me. That suspending judgment is the hardest part.
Yeah, and I think that, like, the questions we ask, like, I was, you know, anytime I spend time with family, I want to ask, like, why did you become so crazy? And that why question is not actually a question. Yes, the time we use the word why, it's an accusation. Like, you are so crazy is really what I should be saying, instead of like, I wonder what your core memories are that are getting you there. I wonder. Like, I'm curious to know, not so I can evaluate you, but like, aha, we've got like different positions and like, actually it looks like different values. So like, I wonder how we're different. And maybe like the question, instead of like, why are you so crazy? It's like, how did you come to think that way? I'm way better at doing this with people I'm not related to. Just to be really clear. I think that's true for most of us. But I think like really the question is, and I don't think this is bad, but like what I hear you saying, Darlene, is like, just go into interview mode. Oh, you think that? Well, where'd you first hear that? Or like, so how does that, how's that inform what you're doing or whatever, like, and we all know that tone is like 90%. So if you say like, oh, I wonder how you came to that idea, it's not going to work out very well. And I think probably if we don't wonder, it's better not to say anything.
All good stuff. Good stuff.
Yeah, I think families are tough. I shared with you maybe 2 weeks ago, I read this book, this alternate narrative by David Graeber about human development that says that there actually were really, really big cities a long time ago that didn't have a king or a tyrant, like people just chose to do that. And he also said that, like, hey, from all the anthropological evidence, like people have always found living with their families difficult. And like from a long, long time ago, people leave. I was like, oh, it's not just a current problem. Like that's a thing. Like being around your people can sometimes be really hard. I thought that was good news. Oh,
So if you really want to.
thank you. If you really want to get along with somebody, let them be themselves, by Willie Nelson.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think about that. I mean, Mike, you're talking about as a parent, you have so many expectations for your kids, even if you don't want to have expectations for your kid, you don't want them to, but to just allow them to be who they are, and just like the whole idea of just radical acceptance, I think is sort of a theme this morning, of just letting people be who they are and accepting them, toilet seats and all,
Yeah, and I think sometimes we get in this weird bit as parents, Julie, at least I do, where I'm like, I see you did that thing. Is that who you are? Because they don't know. I mean, look, when they're young, they don't know. I'm not even sure I know when I do certain things. Is that who I really am? Or is that just a social habit that I've done because I had this friend 20 years ago who made me think it was a cool thing to do? Like, is that really me? Or is that this thing? And like, they don't know. Not always, and we don't always know. And like, maybe that's the question. It's like, I wonder how this is going to play out.
Well, I think that's such a question that kids get all the time. What do you want to be when you grow up? That's such a huge question. But if I think about it, those are things that like shaped, my answers and people's responses to my answers totally shaped decisions that I made. And I think, I don't know, it's a fine line of walking, noticing somebody has an aptitude in something, and kind of forcing that upon them too, or like, oh, you're good at building Legos, you're going to be an engineer, like, I don't know.
It's really great. And, like it influences like the way we talk. Like we used to say, like, tell me about your day. And my daughter would be like, I don't know. And I'd be like, yes, you do. Share your life with me. Or I would say, like, tell me about your day. And it would be like, so-and-so got in trouble, or so-and-so said this mean thing to me. And I was like, oh, like all you're doing is griping about things. So we were like, well, what do you want to remember about your day? What do you want to remember? Well, so-and-so said this mean thing. Like, okay, but is that what you want to remember? Sometimes the answer is yes. And I'm like, dang it, like you're not doing it right. But in general, it's like, no, I guess what I want to remember is I had this really nice snack today. And I'm like, oh, a snack. But that's what she wants to remember. And that's positive. So that's a good thing. The way Brene Brown does it, when people say like, what do you do? She usually says, according to her, tell me how much time you have and I'll tell you what I do. Instead of like, I'm a priest, I'm a doctor, I'm a lawyer, which is again, like pegging people. It's like, well, here's kind of what my core values are that are expressed through my work. But if somebody said like, tell me how much time you have, I'd probably be really annoyed with them because I just wanted to know what they did. Like I just have to be honest. Like I want people to not pigeonhole me, but for convenience sake, I would just like to know what you do. Yeah.
It's been great, everyone. Gotta head
Thank
out.
you. No, we're at time. And so we'll do chapters 20 through 24 next week. And I'm
Okay.
always grateful for your time and thoughtfulness.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.